So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this morning, the Reverend Jim Kellermann. Reverend Kellermann is a retired United Methodist minister, and having served churches ranging in size from 40 to 800 members. He received his Masters of Divinity from Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary, and he and his wife, Polly, who you've already met, live in Green Bay, where they enjoy grandparenting as their primary vocation. They also enjoy backpacking and traveling. And as I mentioned earlier, Jim is my brother in love and a wonderful weaver of stories. So please welcome Jim.
I thank you for inviting me back to be among you. That's feels good to be in this community because I do have a great appreciation for who you are and the way I understand you to operate in terms of your care for one another, care for this community, care for the whole variety of humanity and for all that is creative, that you hold all of that, and it's a wonderful community to move in and out of, and I thank you for this moment to come and sit with you today to share. When Amanda contacted me and invited me back, she suggested there are several things that you might be interested in on the topics that we have, and she was right. She picked some of the things that would have intrigued me, one of which is this one, which is story. I am, in the last half, if not 2/3 of my ministry, recognized that I understood myself to be using story as the primary tool for what was at least part of my vocation, which was preaching. And so story became the way in which I was able to convey things and get people to feel something or identify something and live into it in some way, because a story was the vehicle through which those things happen. So story made sense to me. But after I said yes, then I began to think about stories. And you know, there are a lot of stories, some of which I don't really care about. There are some that are just entertaining, and I will watch, I will read, I will listen to entertaining stories because I like to be entertained, but they're not the stories that fascinate me. I also know that there are certainly genres of stories that I will not touch because they're just too overwhelmingly dark for me. Don't give me a slasher movie. Don't offer me anything that is a horror story. Those just don't. If they grab me the wrong way. So I don't allow those things to be in my reading portfolio. But the stories that take my heart are the ones that I call sacred and holy. Sacred and holy. Not because they are stories about deities or about some rite or ritual or some particular formation of ecclesiastical reality, but they are sacred and holy because they dare to be stories that take you into yourself, take you down to where you touch the common humanity you share, to find where your wholeness is, to find where you touch the deep roots of all creation, and find there the things that sometimes you don't think you are, that sometimes the things you lack. You find healing, you find freedom, you find discovery there, and then you become that which is your higher self. Those stories lead you to something more than what you were before. Those are sacred and holy stories. Those are the stories to which I gravitate. Some time ago, I saw a story, a movie. It's an adolescent story. I think my kids were probably beyond adolescence when it came through, so they weren't necessarily interested in it, but I was captivated by it. It's not an Oscar-winning movie, but it's an intriguing movie. And it's probably 20 or 30 years old by now. I'm in a tesserecting sort of moment, so every time is kind of fluid for me. So 20 or 30 years ago, I saw this movie. So it's a memory from a long time ago. The movie is The Never-Ending Story. See, it touched other people because it's sacred and holy. The never-ending story tells the tale of a young boy, school-age boy, who's, and I'm saying this from memory from years and years ago, a school-age boy whose life is shadowed and darkened because he's bullied at school. He may have had some issues, or it may have been a relocation or some issues at home, but the primary reality is he's being bullied, he's being taunted, he's being abused by those at school that make his life miserable. And one day on his way to school, he recognizes that he's going to have to pass by these bullies who are in front of him. And so he jumps into a bookstore that's at hand to hide in the deepest recesses of its stacks until the bullies are moved on and gotten rid of somehow. And they leave and go off to school. And while he's back in the stacks, he discovers a book that captures his attention, The Never-Ending Story. It's an old text that intrigues him, and he takes it, and when he leaves the bookstore, that book goes with him. When he gets to school, he realizes the darkness that he's approaching, because he's got to go in and face this wall of oppression, this taunting, this darkness that negates him, and so he ends up going up to the attic of the school. And in the middle of this open room, attic room, by himself, he opens the book and begins to read The Never-Ending Story. So the story within the story tells the tale of a fanciful place called Fantasia that is ruled by a very benevolent princess who's about his own age, who has this heart of love for her community, for Fantasia, and is in distress because there's a monster that is invading Fantasia and is consuming it. It's a darkness, a monster of darkness that is negating the edges, that is eroding this Fantasia, this realm of hers. It is the nothingness. It takes the life out of everything, and everything becomes nothingness with this monster. And so the princess says, who will go and save the kingdom? Who will fight for us and drive this monster from the land? And one young boy, about maybe a little bit older than the reader himself, steps forward and says, I will go, princess, and becomes the knight errant. And my vision, my memory is that he flies off on the back of a huge shaggy dog. Is that about right? And flies against this monster, and the boy reading it is fascinated by Fantasia, by the courage of this boy to fly in the face of this monster who battles and enters into some kind of conflict to try and resist this evil that is pressing in upon the land, this nothingness that is consuming. But in the end, the warrior, the knight, falls and calls out to his princesses and says, I failed you. I couldn't defeat the monster. At which point, the princess almost looks up out of the book at the reader himself, describes him, names him. You are the only one who can come and save us. Will you save us? Well, the boy panics. He backs away. How can this be? How can this book know my name? How can this book start knowing who I am? But he's captured by his passion for this Fantasia and for its characters. He can't let it go. And so he goes back to the book, and there is the invitation to come into the book. And somehow, without knowing how or why, he says yes. And suddenly, he finds himself flying freely, joyously, on the back of a great shaggy dog against a monster that is overwhelming, a darkness, but a darkness that cannot consume him because he is filled with this exhilarating joy. And somehow the monster is defeated and driven from the land, and the boy is victorious. Now you understand that the author wants us to feel, to sense that in the book, Fantasia is the boy. It is the boy's world that is under attack. It is the boy who is being made into nothingness. It is the boy who is being negated. It is the boy who is being devalued. That's his feelings. And he thinks he can do nothing about it until he reads a story that identifies within himself a strength to stand up with joy and say, I have value, I have worth, I have joy. You cannot negate me. You cannot make me into nothingness. The story becomes sacred and holy because it allows him to discover that which he didn't know he had will change his life. Sacred and holy stories. It also, I think, helps us understand in a very real way that if you seek to find stories that move you in some way, some powerful way, the only way it happens is if you yourself learn to live in the story. You've got to find the characters that you identify with. You've got to make those journeys with them. You've got to become them. Kurt Vonnegut wrote a short story, included in his Welcome to the Monkey House collection, called Who Am I This Time? This is 50 years ago, 60 years ago, maybe even more than that, for that matter. Vonnegut says that there is a young man in a small town who works in a hardware store. He has no personality, one-dimensional. He's flat. You wouldn't even know he's there. He doesn't exist. He's just a body. If you went to the hardware store and looked for ball-peen hammers, there'd be somebody standing next to it that looked like part of the hardware store. No personality. Except that he's also a member of the community theater program. And at the community theater, when he's assigned a part, he becomes that part. And I can't remember what Vonnegut has him playing, but let's say they assign him the part of Romeo. He becomes Romeo. He's passionate, he's witty, he's charming, he's all of that. He's a tremendous presence on stage. But when he steps off the stage, he's still Romeo. He is Romeo as long as that production is going on. You go to the hardware store to get that ball-peen hammer, Romeo is taking care of you. That's how powerful it is for this young man. Now, the complication is when the production ends, Romeo goes away, and he's a flat personality. Until the next play. Who am I next this time? What character? But you see, it's Vonnegut-esque in that it takes it to the extreme, but it tells us that if you have vitality, it's because you dare to live in the story as real, as a reality for yourself. You become part of the story. I'm one of four brothers. Billy, my older brother, and I are about 18 months apart. Stevie and I are about 2.5 years apart. And then Paulie, my youngest brother, is 2 years younger than that. We were the big boys and the little boys growing up. And we played that way because that's our ages and our difference in ages made us those were our best friends. Stevie and Paulie, Billy and Ginny. That's how we played. Although there were times when our play would overlap. There was a moment, and I used to tell this to my family, and I said, we used to play this all the time. Well, then as I got older and thought about it, I realized we probably played this game once for about half an hour, and my brothers have no memory of it. But for me, it was significant, and I remember it like it was something we did all the time, because it was holy and sacred for me. Because we had watched Zorro, which dates this, and Billy decided one day that he would be Zorro. Black hat, black mask, black cape, Lincoln log sword. And then he burst into the little boy's room, where they were playing, oblivious to what was going on, and he dashed around the room, fighting some fictitious evil swordsman that he had to fight, and trounced off the bed, made a couple of signs of the Z, and then ran out. Now that's what I'm assuming is happening because I wasn't in the room at the time. I was to go in afterwards. I was to go in and explain to the little boys, both to keep them there so they didn't follow Billy out and discover that it was actually Billy and not Zorro, as if they were fooled by that. But I was to keep them there and to tell them they had just been saved by Zorro. Isn't this wonderful? Yay! That was my part. Except I was to do it as Bernardo. Somebody remembers Bernardo. Bernardo was the mute servant of Don Diego, the alter ego of Zorro, who, if you remember the show, Bernardo was always the one pouring the wine. These wealthy Spanish folks would gather around and make their evil plots, and Bernardo was always pouring the wine and serving the dishes, and because he was mute, he sometimes led people to think he was also deaf. So they had no problem talking in front of him. It's just Bernardo, he's just the servant. We ignore him. Well, so they talk their plots out, and he'd be listening and pouring and serving and smiling, and then he'd go and tell Don Diego, the alter ego of Zorro, and then Zorro would go right the wrong, would bring justice back into the reality, but Bernardo was always the one in the middle of the danger, where the enemy was. He sometimes had to be a swordsman. He was a great swordsman at times. He could fight like the best of them. And when it became necessary for Zorro to escape, he would put on the hat. Bernardo would put on the hat. Bernardo would put on the cape, get on the horse, and kind of delay just a moment so that the Spanish guard would see him and chase him that direction. And then they catch up to him and they say, oh, it's only Bernardo. Zorro's gotten away. Bernardo, to me, was that character that was heroic because he dared to be in the most dangerous places and to be engaged in the justice stuff, but was also inclined to be the servant that enabled the others to do the work they needed to do to make that justice come to reality. And I said, that's me. That's my life. And I've always wanted to be the servant who enabled others to be where they needed to be to do the work they had to do. And I always wanted to be heroic in doing it. So that was always a good image for me. That makes Zorro a holy and sacred story for me. And my brothers have no memory of that. But for me, it's my life. About that same time, we had one of the handful of vacations that my father was able to take when we actually traveled someplace. We went to New England, went to New Hampshire, and I got to see the Great Stone Face. The Old Man of the Mountain, you know the Great Stone Face? Some of you do. Some of you remember that, or at least remember the story. If you got to see it, it was a wonderful stone outcropping on the top of a ridge in this valley, and the wind and the weather, the ice and the snow and the rain cut into it, froze, dried, cracked away stone until it shaped a human face, an old man, but with such character that it was, you could see benevolence, it was courageous, it was wise, it had all sorts of deep integrity to it. It was a great face. Unfortunately, wind and rain do not stop when it's artistic work we think is done, and I think in the last 10 years that face sheared off and is gone. Fortunately, Nathaniel Hawthorne saw it at the beginning of the early part of the 19th century, and he included his story of the Great Stone Face, the Old Man of the Mountain, in his Twice Told Tales. And he tells of the village that is below, in this valley below this Great Stone Face, and tells of the people who look up at that face and the legend that is being told about it. And the legend is that sometime in our future, it's prophesied that someone is going to come into this valley who's going to have that face and that character Won't that be something to have that character, that depth of integrity, that depth of wisdom, that depth of benevolence, whatever is there among us? A young boy in that town hears that legend every day, looks up every morning and sees that and understands that this visage of this great stone face is looking down upon him. And every time someone says, hey, somebody's coming into town, this may be the one, this may be the fulfillment of the prophecy, Ernest would go into town to see who it was. And sometimes people would say, well, it could be. But Ernest would say, no, that's not the face. That's not the personality. That's not the depth of character that I expect. And would go home disappointed. Ernest grew up from being a child to a young adult, a youth and a young adult, and eventually on to old age. People came and went. The bishop of the church, an ambassador, a statesman, an orator, a general with medals and courage galore. They all came, they all went. None of them fit the description that Ernest expected. But he kept coming to town every time they said, it might be him. And so they'd come out and see, but it was never the right one. At first, he was greatly disappointed. I think by the time he got to be older, it wasn't quite as disappointing. He was slightly disappointed, but he understood. It's okay. And so as he was walking home after that last time, the children stopped and said, wait a minute. You look just like the great stone face. Yeah. Hawthorne understood that when you tell the story, when you live the story, when it's part of the way you move day by day, you become that character, the depth of character, the integrity of that character. That's who you are. That's holy and sacred story. How many times have I walked the trail from the Shire to the lonely mountain with Bilbo Baggins and a dozen dwarves. And I recognize that Bilbo Baggins is a frightened hobbit, small in stature and timid as could be, doesn't want to leave his house, doesn't want to leave the Shire, and yet somehow ends up facing all of these, faces mountain trolls and orcs and wolves and fire, and eventually, even though he is terrified, he ends up having a conversation with the dragon. That's courage that I wish I had. And I will walk that trail to try and discover that courage inside of me. He has such courage that at the end of that, as the story begins to come to its climax, the friends he has, the dwarfs he has who are myopic about the things that are there, they say, you will not do this, you will not take this from us. But he realizes the only way that these dwarves will survive is if we get help from down below, from the other communities that are there. And that means they've got to look at this same jewel, the same thing, this stone that is so significant. And so that's courage to say in the face of your friends, I know you hate me for this, but I'm doing this to save your life. That's courage. I wish I had that kind of courage. I hope I have that kind of courage. I'm going to keep reading that book until I have that kind of courage. I've also walked that with his nephew, Frodo and Samwise Gamgee, who've made that trek from the Shire. They're on their way to Mordor, to the Mount Doom, because they've got a task that they have volunteered for. In the process, Frodo is stabbed by evil knives that give him a wound that can never be healed. He is struck by huge spiders. He is captured and imprisoned by the orcs. He is beaten. He is destroyed. He is worn out. And Samwise Gamgee keeps him moving, keeps him going. And they get to the fires of Mordor. They cross the great barren wasteland, and they have nothing left. They've spent themselves. They literally are crawling on their hands and knees until they can go no further. And then they go a little bit further and finish the task because they have integrity. They have a commitment they've made that said, I have to do this. I'm driven to do this, even though it's costing us our lives. That's higher self. That's what I wish I had, and I will make that journey with Frodo time and time and time again. Also, think about Madeleine L'Engle, who gives us our 7-year-old granddaughter and our daughter were just reading Madeleine L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time. And so I got to hear part of that. And I'm hearing, again, the story of Meg, who hates the Tesseract, to move through that time warp. It just is painful to her. But she has such deep, pure love for her brother that she is willing to do that tesseracting in order to reach out to him and pull him back, call him back from that which grips him, which is destroying him, which is destroying the planet, which is destroying the human community. And she calls him back with the power of love. That's a depth of love that is higher self. That's holy and sacred story for me. How am I doing? Are we past time? Are we?
Time for another story?
Yeah. Well, this one may be longer. And this is a little bit harder for me. I've read some of Barbara Kingsolver's books, a couple of them. The last one I read was Demon Copperhead. Yes. Amazing writer, but a community, a culture I cannot identify with. I did not grow up in a community where single parenting, who did not know how to parent, stepfathers who beat you and abuse you, foster care families that lock you away and into forced labor, and just constantly this darkness that overwhelms this demon Copperhead. And how he survives that when he's on the edge of being the football hero and busts his knee and now is on painkillers and is part of the drug culture which is rampant in Appalachia, and unemployment and poverty, all of that dark overlay. And somehow he finds the spark of a teacher, of the aunt of his best friend, of a distant relative, somebody who comes in and gives him just a little bit of light in that darkness and keeps him moving until he finds himself able to grow up and mature and withdraw from that darkness and become whole and healthy. It's a complex story and a painful story to read for me much of the time. But the end result is this young man who finds higher self because he keeps finding the sparks in the middle of the darkness that keep him moving, keep him struggling, keep him finding how to clean himself out and up and on to another reality, to give himself definition. That's holy and sacred story. The reality is I recognize you get to choose the things you read, and they may not be the things that I'm reading. And that's quite all right, but I'm hoping the things you're reading, the things you're seeing, the stories you choose to be involved in are ones that take you into them, to make you alive in them in some way, where you find a way to move and navigate whatever the journey is that story takes you on. And that when you come out of it, you're finding your higher self. Stories that offer you your higher self from the depths of your being to what is possible that you didn't think was possible. Holy and sacred. May you find those stories. Thank you.